If you enjoy what we do here at The Spectator, you can subscribe to the magazine and to our online content. Join today and you'll pay just £1 a week for unlimited online and app access in your first year. To subscribe, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. The Tory leadership contest could have been an opportunity for the party to refresh and have a battle of ideas after over a decade in power. Instead, it's been rather vicious in points, and although Liz Truss is far ahead, the blue and blue is worrying plenty of MPs. But who is having the better campaign? To discuss, I'm joined by Isabel Oakeshott and Patrick O'Flynn. Thank you for joining Spectator TV today, Patrick and Isabel. Now, Patrick, you've been very vocal in your admiration for Liz Truss's campaign, suggesting that she has steamrollered Rishi Sunak. Do you think there's any hope for Rishi Sunak at this point, or do you believe the polls are right and it's pretty much a done deal?
Well, I think it's a done deal. I should say, by the way, that I really was a Kemi Badenoch aficionado before that was fashionable, and I wanted her to win. But in a forced choice between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, it seemed to me that she's much the best choice. I think she's run a more mature campaign, and Rishi's inexperience has really told. I think it's been a very macho campaign from him, almost like him and Dominic Raab are doing a remake of Top Gun as Maverick and Goose, and getting their cadets to trash talk Liz, and it's gone down very badly with Tory grassroots members that I speak to, and it seems to a lot of people that kind of Rishi was in love with the idea of winning and isn't really collegiate about the future of the party, and causing collateral damage in the later stages of what's now for him a hopeless campaign.
Crikey.
Isabel, you've written extensively about Rishi Sunak in the past, and in one article recently you said that he was one of the most intelligent and hard-working politicians you've come across. How do you rate his campaign so far?
Well, I thought Patrick's assessment there was a little bit harsh, to say the least. I mean, if only it were a replay of Top Gun Maverick, at least it would be a bit more glamorous, wouldn't it? And I don't think it's really fair to say that Sunak's campaign has been macho. I mean, I'm not quite sure what Paddy's basing that on. Perhaps the early criticisms that he was mansplaining and that he was continually interrupting Liz Truss. I think that the campaign teams corrected that. I was a big, and have been a big, actual admirer of Rishi Sunak. I think he's an extremely able politician, but I think where I would agree with Paddy is in the inexperience, and actually I've been struck by the sort of naivety of the Sunak campaign. I said before all this started privately to some of those involved in the Sunak campaign, look, the only way you're going to have any hope in this is if you offer one or two really significant and totemic tax cuts right at the beginning of your campaign. That then squares off that issue. And they simply would not do that because, they say Rishi genuinely doesn't believe that's the way to sort of address the economic difficulties that we're facing. The problem is that once he decided not to offer any tax cuts, and in fact actually to sort of double down and own that and say, actually, I'm standing on a tax raising agenda, he had no hope whatsoever, in my view. He basically lost the argument before it had even begun, because anyone who has been in any room with any Conservatives over the last few months know that that is basically all they're talking about, the need for tax cuts.
Patrick, I was speaking recently to a supporter of Liz Truss who's been working on her campaign, and they made the point that you really need to focus on the electorate in front of you. The mistake that Tory leadership hopefuls can make is to worry about the one after that, so the general public in an election. Do you think perhaps Rishi Sunak has fallen into that trap compared to Liz Truss, in the sense it feels Liz Truss's plans, her policies, partly what Isabel is saying, are very focused on their membership, whereas Rishi Sunak sometimes seems to be talking to a wider audience?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a wider audience, but it is a different audience. And, you know, he's been characterised, hasn't he, as the archetypal Davos man, and he's clearly won plaudits from leader writers on The Times and The Economist and people like that. It's certainly true, the kind of wider electoral polling shows that tax cuts aren't a great priority for the general public compared to, you know, 4 or 5 other more urgent issues. I think it shows that perhaps Rishi Sunak doesn't know the Conservative membership that well, but I also think it indicates an enormous sense of complacency from him, almost as if, you know, some very senior people in the Conservative Party backstage have been whispering into his ear about him being the natural successor, and you know, he came to believe that and got himself in a lot of wrong positions, not just over not offering tax cuts, but being seen to be the prime instigator of the downfall of Boris Johnson, which again, you know, a more seasoned advisor might have said, you know, you don't want to be anywhere near that. You know, you should row in behind Boris now. You know, I think it went wrong for him the day Munira Mirza walked out on Boris, and Rishi Sunak at a Treasury press conference said about the Keir Starmer Jimmy Savile jibe, I wouldn't have said it, and yet didn't address the point that Keir Starmer had been really brutally rude about Boris Johnson in the seconds before Boris hit back. So from Rishi's point of view, you know, Keir was elevated and Boris was relegated, and I think since then a lot of core Conservatives have had it in for him, basically.
Isabel, what do you make of this betrayal narrative that's definitely gaining some traction when it comes to Rishi Sunak? This idea, as put out by some, that, you know, he ultimately betrayed Boris Johnson, and some go as far, which I don't think the evidence fully supports, to say, you know, he is the reason Boris Johnson is no longer Prime Minister. How does that square up to the politician who, you know, you've studied?
So actually, I think it's a massive comms failure on the part of Rishi Sunak's otherwise very slick operation, that they've allowed that narrative to build up. And I think there are two things going on here. In the eye of the general electorate, which is, as we've been discussing, the eye that Mr. Sunak seems to be focused on, actually it did him no harm whatsoever to be seen as a man of principle, the one that wouldn't take any more of this and put his foot down and said, honestly, I can't go on, because Boris Johnson had become a liability, and there were many reasons which we don't now need to go over for the umpteenth time why Boris Johnson had to go. So on that side, to the general population, I think it's very likely that his decision looked a pretty good one. You know, his resignation letter looked like a man who has integrity and wasn't going to just stay in his job for the sake of it. The problem that he's got in this context is that the Tory membership, we now know, a significant minority of them are still Boris supporters and Boris fans. And we know this almost sort of numerically because of the actual surprising amount of traction that Lord Cruddus's strange and interesting effort to get him back on the ballot paper, or to change the rules for the party membership, that has actually amassed, you know, something like 13,000, you'll probably know the figures better than I do, supporters. So there was obviously a weakness there, but if he had commed it right, if he had actually presented this properly, it didn't need to build up as such a damaging narrative as it has done.
Do you agree with that, Patrick?
Well, I'm not sure I agree now in general that Rishi is kind of more highly thought of than Liz Truss among the electorate at large. I think the last few polls, certainly I think the last two, perhaps YouGov and Redfield and Wilton, have actually showed that she does much better in matchups against Keir Starmer now than he does. So he clearly began the campaign with a marginal advantage on that, partly because of just profile, but that's ebbed away, which really tells us a bit more about what's gone wrong with his campaign. And again, Liz Truss could have responded in kind to all the jibes. She could have raised his fixed penalty notice, his green card, his wife's non-dom status. and indeed the Boris betrayal narrative. Now, she hasn't really done any of that, and I think, not necessarily that she's some kind of angelic figure, but she's not been put under any real pressure by him since we reached the last 2 in the campaign.
That's right. I mean, in a sense, she hasn't needed to do any of that. I mean, once he decided he was standing on a platform of continuity and let's carry on with the highest taxes we've had for 70 years, she really didn't need to do anything else other than say, I'm not going to go down that route. That's it. Easiest campaign ever.
And on that, Isabel, do you think if we go with what the bookies currently point to, what all the polling points to, and we go along with the assumption that right now it looks very likely Liz Truss will be the next Prime Minister, part of the reason they wanted to have this contest over the summer to make sure that, to go to the members was to allow for more scrutiny, to really test out the 2 candidates. Do you think we've had that? Do you think Liz Truss has been tested in this campaign?
Well, I don't think anyone's really tested until they're in the job, and this is why we journalists tend to build people up and then pull them down once they actually get to their destination. I don't think that really, if what you're pointing at is should Rishi Sunak pull out, I don't subscribe to that. I think that there's a process. There's actually, fortunately for us all, not that long to go with that process now, another 3 weeks or whatever it is. And I think, look, they've all got to stick it out. I do feel sorry for the many young people on his campaign who, by the way, aren't being paid. They're doing it for nothing. A lot of young people putting in incredible hours. And yes, it's an amazing experience, but they sort of have a feeling of doom about the whole thing. And we've got to carry on with this charade for the next 3 weeks. But I don't think it would be the right thing to pull the plug on it. And there's no sign that he's thinking of doing that.
And Patrick, is there anything that worries you about Prime Minister Truss from what you've seen so far? We know that she's your preferred candidate of the 2 left, but do you think in terms of media, where do you think her weak points are?
Well, I think she might be a little too wildly Thatcherite for the Red Wall, although polling shows that Red Wall voters seem to prefer her somewhat to Rishi Sunak. I don't think, what the Red Wall was offered, which won them over at the last election by Boris, was a shrinking. They didn't want a shrinking of the state, and she is going to primarily use a kind of tax cutting and therefore stand on your own 2 feet response to the cost of living crisis, in effect challenging people to create more wealth and earn more money. We're yet to see what targeted support she might do for older and poorer voters. So that slightly worries, but I think she's demonstrated a toughness I didn't expect from her. And the key moment, I think, is not now in this walkover against Rishi Sunak, but in the earlier stages. Particularly, there was a point where Kemi Badenoch came quite close to eclipsing her as the challenger of the right, as the dynamic challenger. And we had the first TV debate, I think, on Channel 4, where Liz Truss was very, very weak, very wan, just didn't rise to the occasion at all. And she was in great danger then. But 2 days later, I think it was probably the ITV debate on a Sunday evening, she bounced back really quite strongly. And I thought that took some guts. And since then, she's done just enough every round. And the final 2, I just think, she's faced some fairly hysterical attacks from the Sunak camp, but nothing that's really felt like it's going to derail her. And I think she's growing in confidence, and her media performances are improving too, albeit from a relatively low base.
Isabel, do you think Liz Truss will make a good Prime Minister?
Well, let's hope so. I mean, I agree with Paddy that she's got better in terms of presentation. That was always the single biggest weakness I thought she had. Very sort of poor communicator. I remember sitting through one of her conference set piece at the last Conservative Party conference and thinking that I had never heard a more poorly presented speech, and not only that, the content was absolutely dire. So I do hope that since then things have changed a lot. Look, anyone can have a bad day, and she's certainly doing really well in these televised debates now. So look, I really hope that she's going to be what we need. Otherwise it's just going to be 2 terms and the Tories are 2 years and the Tories are out.
And Patrick, you made a really interesting point just then about is Liz Truss too Thatcherite for the Red Wall? Because I think at this point, it would take quite a big upset, I think, for people to start think, Rishi Sunak has a chance of beating her in the polls. So his supporters would, of course, if they were here, say everything is to play for. But in the past week, I think as it's looked to an interview she gave to the Financial Times, where she said, tax cuts, no handouts, you saw her supporters try to row back a bit from that, saying there could be emergency relief in the face of soaring energy bills. But then again, whenever she is pressed on it, it's very clear her instincts are on reducing the tax burden and not doing what she believes Rishi Sunak is doing, which is basically an imitation Gordon Brown, where you tax people and then you just give them a little bit of that money back. And then you also have the windfall tax. Now, there's some talk today in the papers of how that could be strengthened, and Team Liz have completely hit back at that. They do not want to have a windfall tax that brings them more money or to toughen that up, because I think it's unconservative. So do you think there is a risk that actually some of these policies which poll well, such as the windfall tax, which Liz Truss and if her chancellor is Kwasi Kwarteng are both ideologically opposed to, could lead to a backlash amongst those Red Wall voters?
Yeah, that's certainly a risk. I mean, you know, she's always compared to Margaret Thatcher, isn't she? Or is thought to compare herself to Margaret Thatcher. And, you could look at the early Geoffrey Howe budget, where he basically steamed in, cut top rate tax, cuts lots of other taxes for the better off, and promises this entrepreneurial revolution. Well, fortunately, they had a 4-year term, including the Falklands War victory, but a 4-year term, and the economy had begun to come good. Now, Liz Truss is already in mid-term of a parliament, so going in with that kind of ideological quasi-Kwarteng budget, which lets big corporations off a windfall tax, would be a very hard sell unless, the economy is seen to come right in time for the general election. So if she goes down that route, I think she needs to deliver on other things that Red Wall voters care about, particularly immigration control, particularly, coming up with solutions to the Channel dinghy crisis. I think a much tougher approach on law and order too. There are other policy areas where she can win plaudits from, but it's a very risky thing for her economically to kind of jump from Boris's social democracy, if you like, to hardcore Thatcherite revival.
And finally, Isabel, final question to you. You obviously researched for this biography of Rishi Sunak, and I think you said that you found it hard to find much to dislike. Do you think, if we look at some of the campaign areas you were referring to, is Rishi Sunak just too nice for politics? I thought that at the time that I was researching that biography of Rishi Sunak, I did think that, and it was almost the only thing that I could find that anyone would say that was critical about him, that he perhaps lacked the killer instinct. Now, 2 years is a long time. That book came out a couple of years ago, and I think we have seen that he does have the killer instinct. But a killer instinct is not very useful if your prey is the wrong one. And I think what we have learned is that, yes, he has a killer instinct, but he's not actually targeting the right prey. What I just want to pick up finally on what Paddy was saying about what a shock it might be if they go full-on Thatcherite quite soon on when they take over, if indeed that's what's happening. I actually think they are going to do that. I think that Kwasi Kwarteng is pretty hard line. I think he doesn't mind whether he's popular or not, which is a novelty given the Prime Minister we've had. The outgoing Prime Minister really does want to be popular. I don't think that Mr Kwarteng, if he ends up being the Chancellor, cares about that. I think he wants to do what he regards as the right thing for the country, and I think we're in for a pretty bumpy and exciting time, actually. Well, with that, thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Patrick.